We're going to take you over to the White House. You see there at the podium Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre taking questions from reporters. She's just been asked about the president's Oval Office address. Let's listen.
A place for long years of experience in public life, but there's also a time and a place for new voices, fresh voices, yes, younger voices, and that time and place is now. That is what he said. That is why he laid out why he's passing the torch, why it's time to give it over to new, fresh voices. And he also talked about unity. And I would also refer back to his letter where he talked about also wanting to unify his party.
Did the president believe that his presence in that race was divisive?
I'm not going to get into more than what the president laid out. He talked about unity. He talked about bringing the party together. He talked about putting the country first. He talked about passing over the torch, bringing in new voices. I think he laid out very clearly why he decided to make this decision, and I believe the American people got it. They understood it.
If it was clear, I wouldn't ask the question, but I'll move on.
I think it's clear.
Okay.
I do. So I think the American people do.
For several weeks, the White House has said, had said multiple times that the president was not going to lead the race. He ultimately did. You've also said several times that the president would not pardon or commute the sentences for his son, Hunter. I just want to make sure that that is not going to change over the next 6 months. The president's saying he would not.
It's still a no. It's still a no.
It will always be a no.
It's still a no. It will be a no. It is a no, and I don't have anything else to add. Will he pardon his son? No.
Thank you, Karine. So picking up on Zeke.
Yeah, sure.
For such a monumental decision, the president did address why he left the race.
Well, thank you.
But he left a lot of it for us to read between the lines. He did not make clear why he's leaving the race. Even in the excerpts that you bring up, he says that, the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation. Is he saying it's because he was too old? In another one, he said that it was for the sake of democracy. That does not answer why he thought he was in the way of democracy. So why did he make this decision?
A new generation, and he also said the next sentence was to unite. It's also to unite the nation. Look, the president has talked about this twice. One in a letter that he addressed to the American people on Sunday, laying out a very monumental, to your point, it is a monumental decision that he made, and he thought very long and hard. He also said that he's been serving this country as a public servant for more than 50 years. It is not an easy decision to make. He talked about unity. He talked about the next generation. He talked about passing the torch. I was asked in this room a couple of days, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks ago, all of these days are coming together, that when the president ran in 2020, he talked about passing the torch. He talked about the next generation. He talked about being a bridge to the next generation. And I was asked, is that something that the president still wants to do and still cares about? And I said yes. And so this is part of that, right? This is part of what he said in 2020. He talked about unifying the nation. He talked about unifying the party. And he believed the time was now. The time was now to step down from his reelection and to move ahead with the next 6 months, the end of his term, and that's what he decided to do.
Before he made the decision, he said that there were 3 things that could sway him: the Lord Almighty, a medical condition, and if his team showed him that he could not win. So was it because of the polling?
I can tell you it was not a medical decision, because I've been asked before, and we answered that very straightforward and in a very direct way. I'm just not going to get beyond that.
And then finally, President Biden spent much of his speech talking about the choice that Americans face in November. Trump's campaign manager called it a campaign speech. Your response?
My response is it's not a campaign speech. I will remind my friends on the other side that the president is no longer a candidate.
Thank you, Karine. Democrats on Capitol Hill are being handed this card with talking points about the vice president and the border. Do you know who's handing this out?
I have no idea. You probably should ask her campaign.
So the first one says, Vice President Harris was never appointed border czar. There's never been such a position. It doesn't exist. Why are Democrats so sensitive about the vice president and the border?
Why are Republicans so sensitive about actually not owning up to them getting in the way of a border deal? Why? Why won't they own up to that? Why won't they own up to the last president told them not to move forward? It was a bipartisan deal on just right there, available to them, and they voted twice against it. Twice against it. Why are they so sensitive to moving forward and actually dealing on an issue that majority of Americans care about, is dealing with what's going on at the border?
Do you think that the border would be less of a talking point now if there was less migration to the border, say if somebody had addressed root causes of migration sooner?
Wait, hold on a second. Did you not hear the beginning of I know there were a lot of toppers, but one of the toppers, I talked about what we're seeing at the border. It's down by 55%, not because of Republicans in Congress and what they did. It's because of what this president and this vice president did. He moved forward and took actions to deal with what's going on at the border. Republicans continue to block getting resources to the Border Patrol agents. They continue to block actually dealing with an immigration system. So yes, we are going to debunk the false characterization of the vice president. She was not a border czar, and it's not just us. Independent fact checkers have said the same thing, that did not exist, and that is not true.
And a different topic, Russia and China are teaming up in the skies near Alaska for the first time ever. Are you getting a sense yet, based on everything that's been going on, that some of America's enemies might be looking at what's happening here and think there's nobody in charge?
So let me just say this. There is very much someone in charge. The president is the president until the end of his term. So that statement is certainly false, and we have seen the president bring together our allies and partners. He reinvigorated NATO. He got more than 50 countries behind Ukraine to make sure that they were able to defend themselves against Putin. He stood up to Putin, and he's done a lot more. And now, right now, as we're speaking, I believe it's still happening, the president is having a bilateral conversation meeting with the Prime Minister of Israel. So, who, by the way, the Prime Minister of Israel thanked the president for the work that he's been able to do in helping to make sure that Israel is able to have an ironclad security, right? And so that's that. But let me be clear. I want to actually address the basis of your question outside of saying there's no leadership. Our Department of Defense did not see this activity in Alaska Air Defense Identification Zone as a threat. North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, continues to monitor PRC and Russian activity near North America and to meet presence with presence. U.S. and Canadian aircraft detected, tracked, and intercepted the Russian and PRC aircraft. And more broadly, the U.S. remains concerned about the PRC and Russian collaboration across all instruments of national power that do not promote global stability and security, not just in the Arctic, but the president, if anything, if you look at his foreign policy objectives and what he's been able to do and what the last administration did, the last administration ruined our relationships with our partners and allies. This president had to fix that and make sure that we actually mended our relationship with our partners and allies. And that's what we've been able to do. And a perfect example is what we're seeing with Ukraine being able to defend itself against Russia's aggression. Okay.
So yesterday and again today, you insisted that the president didn't make this decision because of a medical condition. It wasn't about his health. Yesterday, you said that he couldn't finish a second term if he won one. So was this decision to step out of the race just a political calculus? He just didn't think he could beat Trump?
I don't have anything else to add to what the president said himself last night, to what he penned and released to the American people on Sunday. Don't have anything more to add to that. He wanted to unite the country. He wanted to pass the torch. He felt after 50 plus years of public service, the time was to do just that. I don't have anything else to add.
Do you have anything to add on what he teased about proposing reform to the Supreme Court?
So that is something certainly that the president would talk to more about in the upcoming weeks. Just for folks who may have missed that, he said last night, I'm going to call for Supreme Court reform because this is critical to our democracy, Supreme Court reform. And I answered this question, I said this part of to a question yesterday. He believes if you are serving in high office, you should be held to transparency transparency, accountability, and you should be held to high ethics. That's what the president believes. I'm certainly not going to get ahead of the president, and he will have more to share with all of you soon. Tyler.
I know many of my colleagues have asked these questions, and just given the historic nature of the announcement and the decision, I think it's important to get some more transparency. You just said that the president thought long and hard about the decision to exit the race, but also yesterday you said that he made the decision on Saturday night, and prior to that,
you could still think about something long and hard if he started thinking about it on Saturday night and finally made his decision on Sunday.
That doesn't seem like a.
I mean, that's your assumption. But that is your assumption. Not everybody will have that same assumption or thought, right? I mean, it is a decision that he felt that he needed to make, and that was the TikTok of it, if you will. We were laying out to you how it happened, and that's how it happened. That's how the president said it happened.
And do you expect the president to address any further his decision-making process, as my colleagues have asked? Yeah. We don't feel that we have gotten the clarity about how he made this monumental decision, and so obviously we would love an opportunity to ask him questions himself, but barring that, do you think we should expect any more clarity?
Look, I'm not going to, the president's going to make his decision on his own on how much more he wants to share. Obviously, he gave an Oval address and addressed the American people, as he said he was going to do in his letter back on Sunday. And he had a letter on Sunday as well. Maybe there'll be more that he wants to share. We have 6 months. Certainly, the president enjoys taking all of your questions, or he'll continue to do just that. I don't have anything to share beyond what you've heard from the president on Sunday and his Oval address to the American people last night.
Just one last one on sort of the next 6 months. We just asked Kirby about this, but is there anything you can tell us about how operations at the White House may change, the president's schedule may change, anything else that reflects, obviously, he has a lot more time now that he's not going to be a full-time candidate?
I mean, you're right. He has a lot more time now. He won't be a candidate. That is true. And the president said he wants to continue his, obviously, as he was doing before, continue and solely focused on being president and what that means and for the American people, and delivering and building on unprecedented successes that he's been able to get done, right? We still have a lot more to do. We still have to make sure I was just out about the Supreme Court, right? He mentioned that in his speech. I won't get ahead of that. That is something that he cares about. The ethics, right, and transparency, something he wants to make sure that is addressed. Again, not going to get ahead of the president, but he gave a little bit of that. He laid out what he's done for almost 4 years and making sure we're building on that, whether it is continuing to lower costs. He talked about that, bringing down inflation, creating good-paying jobs. All of these historic legislation that he was able to get done, they still have to be implemented. Right? Whether it's the Chips and Science Act, whether it's the infrastructure bill, whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act, there's still a lot of work to get done to make sure that we deliver the good things, the good components of those now laws to the American people. Still a lot to get done. He's focused on it, and we will certainly have more to share. As you know, he's going to be going to Austin on Monday, and so stay tuned. Stay tuned. Go ahead.
Thank you, Karine. So after President Biden said he was going to step aside and endorse Vice President Harris, Democrats quickly coalesced around Vice President Harris. I was wondering if President Biden sought assurances from other leading, Democratic candidates that they would challenge her, that they wouldn't challenge her.
I'm not going to get into specifics or behind-the-scenes conversation. I'm just not. And also that's kind of on the campaign, the political side, so I'm going to be careful from here. Look, I think it's important that what we saw the first 48 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours after the president decided not to run, the coalescing of support behind the vice president, which is not surprising. She has been a partner, a critical partner to this president in everything that we have been able to successfully get done, some historic items that we've been able to get done. She's been a critical partner to this president. She has 4 years, almost 4 years of experience as vice president, also as a senator, also as attorney general. She has an impressive resume, and I have said this before, and I'll say it again, I do not see, and the president obviously did not see anyone else who would be more qualified to step in. And so it is not surprising that she got the support that she has and continues to get, and the president certainly is going to continue to support her.
Thanks, Karine. The president praised Vice President Harris last night in his address.
All right, well, we've been listening to White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre at the daily press briefing. And this one is particularly of interest because it follows President Biden's address to the nation from the Oval Office last night. Many questions about the reason why the president decided to change course and actually withdraw from the race. In response, the press secretary said he wanted to pass the torch, but said it was not a medical decision that caused him to drop out. Earlier in the press briefing, Arweja Zhang asked senior White House communications advisor John Kirby what the administration thought about Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's remarks yesterday.
Did the U.S. find any of Netanyahu's remarks yesterday to be false or misleading?
I'm not going to parse everything he said or do a fact check here from this podium. He should speak for himself about what his views are.
He should, but he had a powerful stage, a joint address before Congress. Do you agree with assertions that Iran financially backs some of the protesters, that if there are Palestinians in Gaza who aren't getting enough food, it's not because Israel is blocking it, as two examples?
So on the first example, we've said ourselves, the Director of National Intelligence came out publicly and said that we do know that Iran has been funding and encouraging some of the protest activity here in the United States, some of it. The problem isn't getting it to Gaza right now. The problem is getting it around Gaza. And one of the reasons why it's so dang difficult to move things around inside Gaza is because there's a war going on.